On December 12, 1863, Captain Thomas Musgrave, a 42-year-old seaman trusted for his order and record-keeping, sailed the small schooner Grafton out of Sydney Harbor toward the far south, equipped with a ship's dinghy, navigation instruments, firearms with limited ammunition, and provisions meant for a speculative voyage. He departed from Sydney for what he expected to be a difficult but manageable commercial run, prospecting for tin and attempting sealing before returning home. But by the morning of January 3, 1864, their search for shelter in the sub-Antarctic turned into a harrowing ordeal of wreckage, isolation, and slow, methodical survival. The question was simple, and it stayed simple for 19 months. Would discipline and craft be enough to outlast a place that did not want them alive? Musgrave was not the kind of captain who relied on bravado. He trusted notes, lists, bearings, and routine, the small rituals that turned panic into labor. He had spent more than 20 years at sea, and the sea had taught him that competence was rarely dramatic. It was repetitive. It was checking a line twice. It was putting things back where they belonged. That habit of structure mattered because the crew was small, and small crews lived and died by how quickly friction became failure. 4 men sailed with him. François Raynal, a 31-year-old Frenchman trained as an engineer and scientist, carried an unusual value on a ship like the Grafton: technical imagination paired with an appetite for hard work. Alexander Alec McLaren, a Norwegian seaman known as practical and steady, served as the mate, or the kind of man who endured misery without announcing it. George Harris, an English seaman, carried the brute skills that mattered when hunger arrived: hunting, killing, handling animals that fought back. Henry Forges, a Portuguese cook, was quieter, mechanically inclined, and adaptable, the sort of person who listened closely when survival became an education. They were not explorers chasing fame. They were working men under contract, following a profit-seeking plan that depended on weather behaving like weather instead of judgment. Before departure, the voyage had carried the details that made it feel controllable. Grafton was a small schooner, modest and not built for sustained punishment, loaded in Sydney with the kinds of items sailors trusted: canvas, rope, tools, and enough food to bridge the unknown gaps of the southern route. Where the dinghy mattered, because a ship's boat was more than a utility. It was contingency made of timber. The navigation instruments mattered too. A compass and a watch were time and direction. They were a way to tell the ocean, at least on paper, that it still had boundaries. And there was a gun with limited ammunition, not for comfort, but for food and for the illusion of leverage. Their planning was not careless. The islands they aimed for were infamous, but the world in the 1860s was filled with infamous places that men still sailed toward because money needed bodies willing to take risks. The route south carried them into colder latitudes, where the air sharpened and the sea darkened, and where weather did not arrive politely. It accumulated, it pressed, it erased. On the Auckland Islands sat deep in the belt, sailors called the Furious Fifties, a region of the Southern Ocean where westerly winds circled the globe with little interruption from land. The climate was wet, cold, windy, and cloud-choked for most of the year, with gales treated not as exceptional events, but as routine conditions. The place had steep cliffs, boggy ground, and dense scrub that resisted movement, a geography that turned distance into exhaustion. Even the insects could become torment, because in such climates exposure was not only cold, it was wet, and wet was a slow theft of heat. The islands were not a backdrop, they were authority. The landscape did not negotiate. It punished mistakes with a calm regularity, and it did not care whether the mistake was a sudden one or a gradual one. But the Auckland Islands were formed by volcanic forces, carved and eroded by weather and time, their western cliffs battered into stark walls, and their inlets offering shelter that could become a trap. The sea around them acted like a machine press, lifting ships and slamming them down with the same rhythm that broke men's bodies in other places. The contradiction was cruel. The islands could look green from a distance. Up close, they were a soaked labyrinth of timber, rock, and mud. Beauty and brutality occupying the same frame. By the night of January 3rd, 1864, Musgrave attempted to find shelter by entering what was later known as Carnley Harbor. The weather deteriorated rapidly. One anchor chain broke. The other anchor dragged. Through the night, the men fought a losing battle, working lines and sails, resetting what could be reset. It's while rain came sideways, and the wind kept rising as if offended by their presence. Near dawn, the hull met rock with a sound that needed no translation. The ship shuddered. Water poured in. Musgrave gave the order that ended normal life and began survival. Abandon ship. It was not a single spectacular moment so much as a cascade of small failures. Anchor chain, dragging anchor, worsening visibility. The ship pressed toward shore by forces that did not tire. The consequence was immediate. Their shelter and transport broke apart against stone. They salvaged what they could in haste: the dinghy, navigation tools, canvas, a gun with limited ammunition, and whatever provisions and equipment could be dragged from the dying schooner before the sea finished its work. There was no radio. There was no signal station. There was no ship waiting beyond the headland. There was no easy way out. The first competent response began within hours, because competence was often a reflex in people who had lived close to risk. Instincts kicked in. They immediately began inventorying what they had, not as an abstract list, but as a countdown clock. Tools, canvas, water sources, fire-making capacity, food, ammunition, clothing, and shelter materials. They gathered what driftwood they could. They poured over the land around their cove, searching for fresh water first, because thirst did not negotiate, and in wet climates a man could still die of dehydration if he could not safely drink. They found a stream. They found timber. And they found seals. The seals were crucial because in places like this, a large animal was not merely food. It was fuel and fabric. A meat for calories, fat for oil and heat, hide for clothing and shelter, sinew for cordage. Harris proved essential in the hunt, and the others learned fast because hunger was an instructor that did not wait for readiness. Killing a large seal was ugly work. It was physical, slippery, loud. The sound of a club striking bone was not cinematic. It was administrative. A problem solved with force because there were few other tools. By the end of their first days, Musgrave did what some leaders failed to do even in less extreme situations. He imposed routine. Not tyranny, but structure. Tasks were assigned. Arguments were kept from escalating into fractures. Cleanliness was required because skin infections and illness could become fatal in damp cold. They kept track of days because time, without markers, became a swamp that swallowed purpose. And yet, even with competence, the environment kept doing what it did. It wore them down in small increments, the constant wet trying to turn labor into futility. Within the first weeks, they lived under makeshift shelter made from sails and canvas, a fragile layer between human skin and the island's appetite. The wind worked at the edges of their coverings like fingers trying to peel them away. At night, the soundscape did not settle. Trees groaned, rain drummed, the shoreline churned. Sleep arrived in fragments. By April 1864, they shifted from improvisation to construction. Using salvaged timber from the wreck and trees felled from the surrounding forest, they built a hut. They named it Epigwait, a refuge not in the spiritual sense but in the practical one. Walls, roof, a fireplace. It was shelter engineered from stubbornness. And they used lime mortar made by burning shells because the island did not provide cement, and the sea did not care that humans preferred convenience. They cleared a boat run to access the sea more easily, because movement mattered, and so did minimizing injury. Every scraped shin could become infection. Every cold night could become pneumonia. Once the hut stood, their survival entered a phase that looked almost stable from a distance. That was the first false hope. Because stability in hostile environments often meant only that the obvious dangers had been replaced by the quieter ones. They began to build industry. Raynal constructed a crude forge. The act was not romantic, it was necessity, because metal tools broke, and broken tools became broken plans. They made charcoal to fire it, and they worked metal salvaged from the wreck into usable forms. They fashioned a world where the island had offered none. They made soap. They made games, card and board games, to stop the mind from collapsing inward. They taught each other languages. One of the crew learned to read and write. When ink ran out, they used seal blood for writing, because even documentation became a survival tool, a way to preserve order. By mid-1864, months had crept forward, and no ship arrived. The men began to understand a bleak arithmetic. They could survive here, perhaps, but survival without rescue was only prolonged dying. The Auckland Islands sat remote, and ships avoided them because cliffs and weather made approach dangerous. The world did not revolve around 5 missing men. There was no institutional search apparatus waiting to activate. In an era before radio and organized rescue, absence could remain invisible for a long time, and invisible meant unhelped. And then something changed. It was not a single dramatic moment. It was a gradual hardening, the mental shift from waiting for rescue to manufacturing it. Because of this, the dinghy ceased to be a small boat and became a blueprint. Around August 1864, after roughly 7 months of being castaways, they began modifying the ship's dinghy into a craft large enough to attempt the crossing to Stewart Island. It was an idea balanced between engineering and desperation. A small boat was not meant for an ocean that could erase ships, but the alternative was staying until illness or accident completed the island's work. They gathered tools, made more tools, then made tools that made other tools. They salvaged fittings, but hammered scraps into fasteners, and tested what they built because test failures on land were survivable. Test failures at sea were not. The plan had an ugly constraint: capacity. With enough supplies to attempt an open ocean crossing, food, water, and whatever equipment they could carry, the rebuilt craft could not safely take 5 men. That meant leaving 2 behind, trusting not only that the crossing would succeed, but that the men who reached civilization would return. It was the kind of decision that stripped agency even as it pretended to create it. Someone would go. Someone would stay. Either way, they were still trapped by geography. With limited options, they made a fateful choice. Musgrave went because navigation and persuasion would matter in port. De Raynal went because he understood the boat's construction and could repair it at sea. Henry Forges went because 3 men were a minimum for sail, steering, and bailing through heavy water. McLaren and Harris stayed behind to maintain epic weight, to keep hunting, to keep a signal ready, and to wait in a way that did not become passive death. On July 19, 1865, after 19 months on Auckland Island, they launched the modified boat. The sea did not honor courage. It honored geometry, timing, and luck. The departure was quiet. Men who had suffered together rarely dramatized the suffering in farewell. A hand grip. A look held half a second longer than usual. Then the boat moved into gray water, and the island receded into wet green and black, the hut hidden behind trees. The 2 remaining men shrinking into the background until distance made them almost imaginary. That was the second false hope, because leaving the island did not mean escaping it, The ocean was the same system, only larger. Within days, weather changed. Clouds lowered, wind sharpened, waves stacked into steep, punishing walls. The boat was small, still. The three men bailed constantly. Their hands swelled and split. Salt stung every cut. The cold entered the body not as an instant dramatic shock, but as a steady occupation, a numbness that stole fine motor control first, then judgment. Navigation became a problem of approximations. With cloud cover, celestial sightings were unreliable. Musgrave aimed for Stewart Island, roughly 280 miles away, an inhabited outpost that represented the thinnest edge of civilization. I miss it, and there was more ocean, more latitude, and the slow, lethal slide toward colder waters where a mistake could mean hypothermia before dawn. On the fifth day, conditions eased enough to reveal the horizon. Land appeared low and dark. Stewart Island. They made landfall on July 24th, 1865. Their clothing was stiff with salt. Their bodies carried the blunt fatigue of 5 days without real sleep. They were not triumphant. They were hollowed out by effort. But they were alive, and alive meant that the next task began immediately, converting survival into rescue. Meanwhile, far from the sub-Antarctic cove where McLaren and Harris maintained the hut and watched the horizon, the world had begun to learn what Musgrave already knew in his bones. Rescue was not automatic. Even after reaching people, that Musgrave still had to convince them to go south into dangerous waters during a season when storms were routine and ship owners weighed human life against risk to vessels and crews. In ports, sympathy did not equal action. There was no formal institution charged with saving 2 men on a remote island. The consequence was immediate: delay. Back on Auckland Island, weeks passed after the boat's departure, and McLaren and Harris had no way of knowing whether their companions had reached land or drowned. Their survival became a smaller version of what they had already done, but with fewer hands to do it. They hunted. They repaired storm damage. They maintained routines to stop the mind from collapsing into fear. They kept a signal ready, because hope without preparation was only fantasy. That was the third false hope. It's because hope depended on evidence, and evidence did not arrive. In early September 1865, Musgrave secured a schooner called the Flying Scud and insisted on serving as pilot. The decision was practical. He knew the approaches. He knew the hazards. He had stared at that coastline long enough to remember it in his sleep. The Flying Scud headed south. Fog and weather attempted to erase landmarks. Musgrave guided the vessel into Carnley Harbor, back toward the cove where Epigwait stood. As the ship rounded the final headland, the shoreline came into view in fragments: dark scrub, wet slopes, the dull sheen of water. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then 2 figures emerged. McLaren and Harris ran toward the shore, waving. They had survived the waiting. They had not been swallowed. All 5 men left the island together. Or the rescue did not end with a cinematic moment. It ended with the same kind of labor that had defined the entire ordeal. Gathering what mattered, securing evidence, bringing journals, tools, and remnants of their work back to a world that would otherwise reduce their survival to rumor. In the aftermath, the story did not remain private. Published accounts documented their months of work and the mechanics of how they survived: the hut, the forge, the routines, the improvised manufacturing. Their survival became part of the history that later pushed governments to treat castaway survival not as an individual moral test, but as a logistical problem that could be mitigated. News of shipwrecks in those sub-Antarctic waters helped drive a system of castaway depots, shelters stocked with food, clothing, tools, medicine, and other necessities. because repeated disasters made it obvious that the environment would keep taking ships, and that institutional response could determine whether survivors lived long enough to be found. The depots carried biscuits, tinned meat, matches, cooking utensils, tools, fishing gear, blankets, and a medicine chest, a practical admission that the sea route demanded preparation beyond individual competence. Musgrave's case, and others like it, helped build that response. It did not change the weather. It changed the odds. The legacy of Epigwait remained physical. Remnants of the wreck and the hut site were documented as historic evidence. The stone fireplace, the anchors, the trace of a small human world built against constant wind and rain. The site became a memory of how survival often looked from the inside. Work, and repetition, repair, and the refusal to let days become meaningless. The story's meaning did not sit in hero worship. It sat in a more uncomfortable truth. They survived not by conquering the Auckland Islands, but by submitting to reality faster than the reality could grind them down. They treated the environment as an antagonist that could not be reasoned with, only managed. They treated their own minds as systems that required maintenance. Routine was not a personality quirk. It was medicine. Cooperation was not moral virtue. It was engineering. The islands took what they always took from those who arrived unprepared: time, comfort, certainty, and any belief that survival was a matter of willpower alone. It did not take what remained when all the softer things were stripped away: the capacity to work, to organize, to share labor, and to keep building even when the result was fragile. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink what survival actually costs, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more true stories of endurance and human limits, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.